In the 1960s, officials drew 4 great rings around London, plans for 8-lane motorways that would slice through places like Camden and Brixton. Nearly 150 miles of city streets were threatened with erasure. The newly minted Greater London Council had the power and the will to build. All of it was set in motion by a single report, Traffic in Towns, 1963. The London that millions love today almost vanished. How close did we actually come, and who tried to stop it? Colin Buchanan's name carried weight in Whitehall. In 1963, he delivered a report that landed like a thunderclap: Traffic in Towns. The diagnosis was stark. Cities were choking on cars, streets built for horses and handcarts now heaved under 1 million engines, each demanding space, each promising gridlock. Buchanan's prescription was unapologetic. If Britain wanted to keep pace, it had to rebuild its cities for the automobile. He described a future where roads must be widened, buildings sacrificed, entire neighbourhoods reimagined for the relentless flow of traffic. The Ministry of Transport seized on his logic. Internal memos from the time reveal a feverish optimism. Here was a blueprint to rescue London from paralysis. The language was clinical, almost surgical: segregation of vehicles and pedestrians, removal of obsolete fabric. Buchanan was not blind to the cost. He warned of the risks, the loss of community, the threat to history. But for the technocrats of the 1960s, the promise of movement seemed worth the price. They saw a city on the operating table and they reached for the scalpel. A new force arrived at County Hall in 1965. The Greater London Council, known as the GLC, swept in with a fresh mandate and the authority to redraw the city's future. Within months, its planners gathered around long tables, poring over inherited maps and drafting new ones, their pens tracing lines that would soon become official. The charter of the GLC gave them power over transport, housing and planning across the capital, a reach no council had ever held before. In their first Transport Committee meetings, the language was brisk and decisive, with phrases such as comprehensive solutions, strategic corridors, and orbital routes. The old London County Council had whispered about road schemes, and the GLC wrote them in ink. By 1966, the first sketches of the Ringways appeared in council minutes: 4 vast motorway loops, each slicing deeper into the city's heart. 8-lane highways were plotted through neighbourhoods that had stood for centuries. The planners worked largely unseen, but their decisions carried weight. With every new map, London's fate seemed less a question of if and more a matter of when. On a quiet morning in Camden town, a letter slid through the door of a family shop on Inverness Street. The envelope was stamped with the authority of the Greater London Council. Inside, a notice. Under the Highways Act 1959, the property was now listed for compulsory purchase. No explanation, just a line on a map and a date by which the family must leave. The route for Ringway 1 would pass within half a mile of the market, skirting the canal and slicing through terraces that had stood for generations. Camden's traders, bakers and tailors, some with roots in the same shopfront since the war, found their addresses in the council's files, marked for acquisition. Across London, thousands of homes and businesses faced the same fate, but in Camden, the threat felt personal. The lines on the planners' maps were not abstract anymore. They meant a mother packing up her bakery, a grandfather clearing the last of his stock, a child staring at an empty window. The city's future for these families had arrived on official paper, cold, final, and impossible to ignore. Concrete pillars rose above North Kensington, casting long shadows over the streets below. The Westway, a 3.5-mile stretch of elevated motorway, opened in 1970, slicing through the city with a confidence that left little room for doubt. At its inauguration, it was the longest continuous deck of reinforced concrete in Britain, a record that did nothing to comfort the people whose homes had vanished beneath its path. Entire rows of Victorian terraces disappeared almost overnight. Children woke to the roar of pile drivers, their classrooms shaking as demolition crews advanced, street by street. For the families who lived on Acklam Road, the world changed in a matter of months. Letters from the council promised relocation, but no amount of official language could soften the loss. Oral histories recall the sense of powerlessness, the disbelief as familiar corners became rubble fields. The Westway was only the beginning, a visible fragment of a much larger plan. Its looming presence proved that the threat was real, and that no neighbourhood, no matter how storied, was safe from the lines drawn in distant offices. April 1969. Camden Town Hall overflowed with voices, some trembling with fear, others burning with anger. The council chamber echoed with chants and the scrape of folding chairs as residents, traders and students pressed against the walls, clutching copies of the day's headlines. Outside, banners snapped in the spring wind. Save our streets. No motorway through Camden. At the centre of the storm stood John Buchanan, poet and campaigner, his words carrying above the crowd. He spoke of lost domes and vanished terraces, of London's patchwork beauty threatened by concrete and noise. His voice, caught by BBC microphones, turned a technical plan into a cultural crisis. The press caught every word. Barbarism in the name of progress, a monstrous scheme. That evening, front pages across London carried images of ordinary people, arms linked, refusing to be erased. Heritage campaigners led the chants, transforming private dread into public defiance. For the first time, the planners in County Hall faced not just objections, but a movement. The city's past was no longer silent. It had found its champions, and they would not be moved. On paper, the Ringways began as a bold promise, £300 million to redraw London for the age of the car. But as engineers revised their calculations and land prices soared, the figure ballooned. Treasury memos from 1972 warned of a runaway bill, £1.2 billion and counting, 4 times the original estimate. The numbers alone staggered ministers, but each pound carried a deeper cost, the loss of trust, the sense that London was being gambled away. In the spring of 1973, the city went to the polls. Labour candidates, once architects of the scheme, now campaigned with a single blunt message: no more motorways through people's homes. The result was ambiguous. The Greater London Council changed hands in May, swept by a wave of anti-road feeling that cut across party lines. Within months, the Great Highway Plan lay in ruins. The dream of a city remade for the car had collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind only fragments, and a city forever changed by what almost happened. The market on Camden Lock began as a handful of stalls in 1974, pitched by local dreamers in the shadow of old warehouses. They sold handmade pottery, vintage clothes, second-hand books, anything that could catch the eye of a passing Londoner. By the end of the 1970s, the market had become a living organism, drawing crowds from every corner of the city. Footfall soared into the hundreds of thousands, then millions, as word spread about the riot of colour and noise along the canal. Traders who once feared eviction became pioneers of a new economy, artists, bakers and musicians carving out futures on streets that were nearly lost to bulldozers. By the 1980s, Camden was more than a market. It was a magnet for creativity, a place where history and invention met face to face. The survival of these streets did not just preserve old bricks, it gave London a second heartbeat. Imagine the heart of Camden replaced by a 10-acre motorway junction, 8 lanes of concrete and looping flyovers where today there is music, laughter, and the scent of street food drifting along the canal. Urban planners once modelled this future in stark detail. Traffic simulations, flow diagrams, the promise of efficiency mapped over centuries of life. The Westway's shadow still stretches across North Kensington, its 23 reclaimed acres now home to skate parks and gardens, remnants of a compromise between destruction and survival. These models offered certainty, but at a cost no spreadsheet could capture. When the Silvertown Tunnel was debated decades later, echoes of the Ringways haunted the arguments. How many cities can afford to lose their soul for the sake of speed? London's survival was not inevitable. The question lingers for every new mega project. What kind of city do we want to inherit? London's streets still face pressure, from rising car use to calls for new infrastructure. Each year, over 1 million more vehicles enter Greater London, testing what survived the bulldozers. The city's future depends on what we choose to protect next. What would you fight to keep standing?